The message arrived through channels I had trusted for 20 years, carried by astropaths whose screaming minds translated warp signals into comprehensible language, their sacrifice enabling communication across the void between stars. I'm Governor Lethric Mordain, inheritor of a legacy that spans 3 generations, ruler of Salvarus Secundus, a mining world that had served the Imperium faithfully since my grandfather first received the seal of office from representatives of the Adeptus Terra. Our family's history is written in tonnage delivered, in soldiers trained and sent to die on distant battlefields, in psychers surrendered to the black ships without protest or complaint. We had fulfilled every obligation, met every assessment, maintained every protocol that the Emperor's vast bureaucracy demanded of us. That morning began like 10,000 mornings before it. I woke in chambers that reflected 3 generations of accumulated wealth, surrounded by furniture crafted from imported wood, beneath ceiling frescoes depicting the Emperor's glory, looking out windows that showed the sprawling industrial complexes that justified our world's existence. My wife, Helena, lay beside me in the massive bed that had belonged to my parents and grandparents before them, her breathing soft and regular, her face peaceful in sleep. I rose without waking her, following routines established over decades, preparing for another day of governance that I expected would resemble every other day I had experienced. The palace servitors moved through their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, their enhanced limbs and augmented brains enabling efficiency that unmodified humans could never match. They had been people once. Volunteers or criminals, or simply those who sold their bodies to the Adeptus Mechanicus for processing and reassignment. Now they were tools, biological machines that performed their functions without complaint or consideration, perfect servants for an empire that valued reliability over humanity. One brought my morning recaf, the bitter stimulant that helped clear my mind for the day's work. Another laid out my gubernatorial robes, the formal garments that represented my authority and position. A third activated the data screens that would display the overnight reports from across our world's mining operations. I reviewed production figures while consuming my breakfast, noting with satisfaction that Complex 7 had exceeded its quota by 6%, that Complex 3 had resolved the equipment malfunction reported the previous week, that overall output remained stable and predictable. Salvarus Secundus was not a wealthy world, not a paradise, not one of the jewels of the Imperium where nobility lived in luxury while populations suffered in ignorance. We were a working world, a productive world, a place where everyone understood their role in the vast machinery that sustained humanity's interstellar empire. The mines produced ore. The forgers processed that ore into useful materials. The PDF trained soldiers. The tithes were paid. The system functioned. My senior administrative servitor entered the dining hall at precisely 0700 hours, its timing calibrated to interrupt my meal at the moment when I would be most receptive to receiving reports. The thing had been modified extensively, its skull replaced with a cogitator housing, its eyes augmented with data processing lenses, its vocal cords enhanced with Vox synthesis equipment that produced unnaturally clear speech. It approached to the designated distance, exactly 3 meters from my position, and stood waiting for acknowledgement before delivering its message. I gestured permission, expecting routine information about scheduling adjustments or minor administrative matters. Instead, the servitor's synthesized voice carried classification markers that indicated urgency beyond normal operational concerns. Governor Mordain, astropathic communication received through Orbital Relay Station 7 at 0643 hours. Priority classification Theta 9. Content relates to seismic activity detected in mining sectors 4, 5, and 6. Immediate review requested by senior geologist staff and mining operations directors. Emergency protocols have been activated. Casualty estimates are preliminary and incomplete. The The words registered slowly, my mind initially refusing to process their implications. Seismic activity was common on Salvarus Secundus, our world's geology, providing both opportunity and challenge. Easy access to mineral deposits, balanced against the constant risk of tremors and shifts in the planetary crust. But Theta 9 classification indicated something beyond routine danger, beyond the manageable risks we accepted as part of our industrial operations. And casualty estimates suggested that whatever had occurred involved more than equipment damage or minor injuries. I abandoned my breakfast immediately, Helena stirring at the sudden movement but not waking, her rest undisturbed by the crisis that was beginning to consume my attention. The servitor led me through the palace corridors to my command center, the fortified room where I maintained communications with every major facility on our world, where hololithic displays showed real-time data from mining operations, planetary defense installations, orbital platforms, and the various administrative centers that comprised our governmental infrastructure. The command center was already occupied when I arrived. My senior staff gathered around the central display, their faces showing expressions that confirmed the severity of whatever had occurred. Chief Geologist Sorella Venn stood at the primary console, her augmetic eyes processing data faster than her organic brain could consciously register, her mechanical fingers dancing across control surfaces with inhuman speed and precision. She had served my father before me, her expertise in planetary geology making her invaluable for managing the seismic challenges that came with deep mining operations. "Governor," she said without turning from her displays, the seismic event registered at magnitude 8.7 on the Imperial standardized scale. Epicenter was located directly beneath the primary ore extraction galleries of mining complexes 4, 5, and 6. The initial shock triggered cascade failures across all 3 facilities, resulting in complete structural collapse of primary and secondary galleries, catastrophic failure of atmospheric control systems, and total loss of surface communications with underground operations. The hololithic display shifted to show a 3-dimensional representation of the affected mining complexes, the massive underground structures that extended kilometers beneath the planetary surface, following ore veins through rock and earth with tunnels and galleries that had taken decades to excavate and fortify. The display showed them in red, indicating complete system failure across every category of measurement. No power, no air circulation, no communications, no seismic stability. These were not facilities experiencing technical difficulties requiring repair crews and emergency response. These were destroyed structures, collapsed and buried, their galleries filled with rubble and their workers either dead or soon to be dead as oxygen supplies depleted and toxic gases accumulated. "How many workers were present when the event occurred?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be measured in hundreds of thousands rather than dozens or hundreds. "Shift rotation had just completed," Venn replied, her voice carrying the flat effect that resulted from her Vox augmetic throat replacement. Primary shift personnel totaled 217,000 across all 3 facilities. Secondary shift personnel totaling an additional 43,000 were in surface support structures when the event occurred. Preliminary casualty estimates suggest that approximately 12,000 workers reached surface evacuation points before emergency seals engaged. The remainder are presumed lost, 205,000 dead. The number was too large to comprehend immediately, my mind struggling to convert abstract data into understanding of the actual human cost. These were not statistics or theoretical casualties from military operations on distant worlds. These were citizens of Salvarus Secundus, workers who had reported for their shifts expecting routine danger and manageable risk. Families that would now receive notification that their loved ones had died instantly when millions of tons of rock collapsed on galleries that were supposed to be engineered against such failures. But personal grief would have to wait. I was the planetary governor, responsible for managing crises that affected millions, required to think beyond individual tragedy, to consider the larger implications for our world's ability to continue functioning as a productive imperial asset. The 3 destroyed complexes represented 60% of our total ore production capacity. Without them, Salvarus Secundus could not meet its assessed imperial tithe obligations, and failure to meet the tithe carried consequences that would affect everyone on our world, living and dead, loyal and faithful regardless of circumstance. "Show me the structural analysis," I ordered, forcing my voice to remain steady and authoritative despite the horror settling into my awareness. "What are our options for restoring production capacity?" Ven manipulated her controls, the hololithic display shifting to show geological surveys and engineering assessments that had been compiled over the hours since the seismic event. The data was unambiguous and damning. The earthquake had fundamentally altered the stability of the entire northern mining region, rendering the previous complex locations unsuitable for reconstruction without expenditures that would exceed our planetary GDP by factors that made such rebuilding economically impossible. Alternative sites existed, locations where ore deposits could be accessed and extraction operations established. But developing new facilities of equivalent capacity would require decades of investment and construction. "We could theoretically rebuild at different locations," Ven explained, her augmetic eyes continuing to scan data even as she spoke. "But realistic timelines suggest 20 to 30 years before new facilities reach the production capacity of the destroyed complexes. That assumes optimal conditions, unlimited funding, and no additional geological complications. Given our actual circumstances, the timeline extends to 40 or 50 years. 40 years. The number was meaningless for our immediate crisis. The Imperial tithe assessment for Salvarus Secundus had been calculated 5 years ago during the last scheduled review conducted by representatives of the Departamento Exacta. Those calculations assumed complexes 4, 5, and 6 operating at full capacity, their output forming the foundation of our total ore production that justified our world's tithe grade and determined the tonnage we were required to deliver. The next tithe collection would arrive according to established schedules, their ships expecting us to deliver 1,200,000 tons of processed ore regardless of what disasters had occurred in the interval between assessments. Without the 3 destroyed complexes, we could produce perhaps 700,000 tons if we pushed our remaining facilities beyond recommended capacity limits. The shortfall was absolute, mathematical, impossible to resolve through effort or sacrifice or determination. We simply lacked the physical infrastructure to extract and process ore that the Imperium expected us to deliver. "Calculate every possible measure for increasing output from remaining facilities," I ordered, already knowing the results would prove insufficient. "Strip reserves if necessary. Purchase imports if possible. I need options for meeting our tithe obligations with current capacity." My staff scattered to their assigned tasks, servitors and human administrators working in parallel to analyze our situation and identify any combination of measures that might address the crisis we faced. I spent those hours pacing the command center, reviewing casualty reports as they arrived from surface recovery operations, authorizing emergency response protocols that I knew would save perhaps hundreds of workers still trapped in accessible galleries while thousands more died in collapsed sections beyond any hope of rescue. The analysis took 3 days to complete, 3 days of exhaustive calculation and desperate searching for solutions that might bridge the gap between what we could produce and what the Imperium demanded. My senior economic advisor, a man named Tertius Galen, whose enhanced calculating organs allowed him to process financial data with superhuman speed, presented the final assessment with expressions that revealed the answer before he spoke. "Governor, Even utilizing every extreme measure available to us, we cannot meet the assessed tithe obligation. Our maximum possible output, achieved by operating remaining facilities at 130% capacity, stripping all strategic reserves, purchasing maximum available imports from neighboring systems, and cannibalizing selected infrastructure for processed materials, totals approximately 890,000 tons. The shortfall is 310,000 tons that we cannot acquire through any means currently available to our world. 310,000 tons. The number hung in the air between us, representing not just awe, but the measure of our failure, the quantification of circumstances beyond our control that would nevertheless result in consequences determined by imperial law and bureaucratic procedure. I had governed Salvaris Secundus for 23 years without significant incident, maintaining production quotas, delivering tithes on schedule, managing the routine crises that affected all mining worlds without allowing them to compromise our obligations to the Imperium. And now, a single geological event, a natural disaster that could not have been predicted or prevented, had created a crisis that would destroy everything my family had built over 3 generations. Unless the administratum adjusted our tithe assessment to reflect our new circumstances. The petition took another day to compose, every word carefully chosen, every clause constructed according to protocols established through 10,000 years of bureaucratic tradition. I detailed the seismic event with clinical precision, attaching geological surveys, casualty figures, production capacity analysis, and engineering assessments that documented our situation with the thoroughness that imperial authorities demanded. I explained our current maximum output capacity, calculated at 890,000 tons, assuming extreme measures that would strain our remaining infrastructure to breaking point. I requested a tithe reduction to 700,000 tons, a more sustainable figure that would allow us to meet our obligations without destroying our world's ability to function as a productive imperial asset in future assessment periods. The petition cited imperial law regarding natural disasters affecting tithe compliance, referencing precedent from similar cases on other worlds where assessments had been adjusted following catastrophic events. I included every piece of supporting documentation that might influence the review process, every data point that might demonstrate our good faith efforts to maintain compliance despite impossible circumstances. The finished document was comprehensive, professional, constructed with the expertise that came from 3 generations of my family, learning to navigate the administratum's complex requirements and expectations. I authorized transmission on the 4th day after the disaster, watching as our astropathic choir encoded the message for warp transit, their psychic abilities enabling communication across interstellar distances that would otherwise take decades or centuries for physical ships to traverse. The senior astropath, a woman whose eyes had been burned out by the psychic awakening that had made her valuable to the Imperium, assured me the message had been transmitted successfully, received by relay stations, forwarded to the appropriate sector administratum facility for processing and review. Now we waited. The administratum's bureaucracy was legendary, vast departments processing billions of requests annually, layers of hierarchy requiring approval at multiple levels before any decision could be finalized and communicated. I understood this reality, accepted it as the inevitable consequence of governing an empire that spanned millions of worlds and trillions of souls. Messages took time to be reviewed. Petitions required evaluation by specialists who might be assigned to hundreds of other cases simultaneously. Decisions needed approval from authorities who might be dealing with crises affecting entire sectors or subsectors. But understanding the system's limitations did not reduce the anxiety that accompanied waiting for a response that would determine my world's fate and my family's future. 6 months passed with no acknowledgement of our petition beyond the automated confirmation that it had been received by sector administrative facilities. Our remaining mining complexes operated at the absolute limits of their design specifications. Machinery pushed beyond recommended stress tolerances. Workers laboring through extended shifts that violated standard safety protocols. We suffered accidents, equipment failures, productivity losses that inevitably accompanied attempts to exceed capacity designed into our infrastructure. Workers died in cave-ins that proper maintenance schedules might have prevented. Machinery broke down from overuse, requiring repairs that consumed resources we needed for ore production. Efficiency declined even as we demanded more output, the mathematics of industrial operations proving inexorable regardless of our desperation or determination. I checked daily with our astropathic choir, requesting confirmation that our petition remained active in the Administratum's processing queues, searching for any update on review status or expected decision timeline. The astropaths could confirm only that the message had been received, entered into the appropriate bureaucratic channels, assigned some classification code that meant nothing to anyone outside the Administratum's internal systems. Whether our petition was being reviewed, or had been reviewed and assigned for higher-level consideration, or had been lost in the vast machinery of Imperial bureaucracy, they could not determine from their position in the communication network. I began sleeping poorly, waking in the middle of rest cycles with my mind immediately focused on the petition, running through increasingly desperate contingency plans if the Administratum denied our request or simply failed to respond before the Tithe collection fleet arrived. Helena noticed my deteriorating condition, commented on my distraction during social functions, suggested I delegate some responsibilities to my senior staff to reduce the stress affecting my health and judgment. But I could not delegate this crisis, could not share the burden of knowing that our world faced potential destruction because of circumstances beyond our control and a petition that might be languishing unreviewed in some bureaucrat's processing queue. 12 months after I submitted the petition, I noticed changes in my own behavior that suggested the prolonged stress was affecting my psychological stability. I would find myself standing in corridors, with no memory of deciding to walk there, my consciousness consumed by obsessive calculation of the approaching Tithe deadline and our diminishing options for meeting it. I snapped at staff members who delivered routine reports, my temper fraying under the constant pressure of waiting for news that never came. I avoided social functions where other nobles might ask questions about our world's production status, unable to maintain the pretense of confidence when I felt only mounting dread about the crisis we faced. My personal physician, concerned about indicators of stress-related health deterioration, prescribed medication to help regulate my sleep cycles and moderate my anxiety responses. The chemicals helped me function more effectively during waking hours, but could not address the fundamental source of my distress. Each day that passed without response from the Administratum brought us closer to the Tithe collection deadline. Each week of silence increased the likelihood that our petition had been lost or misfiled, or simply buried beneath millions of other requests awaiting review. Each month of waiting eroded my confidence that the system would acknowledge our circumstances before consequences became inevitable. 18 months after I submitted the petition, our orbital monitoring stations detected the arrival of ships in the outer system, their warp signatures identifying them as Administratum vessels, their trajectory indicating they were approaching Salvarus Secundus according to standard Tithe collection protocols. The Tithe fleet had arrived. I watched them on the hololithic displays in my command center, massive cargo haulers designed to transport the millions of tons of materials collected across dozens of worlds, escorted by Imperial Navy vessels whose presence ensured compliance and discouraged any thoughts of resistance or rebellion. They moved through our system with the ponderous inevitability of celestial bodies following gravitational laws, their course calculated to bring them into stationary orbit around our world, where they would remain while surface operations gathered and transported the assessed tithes to their cargo holds. The lead shuttle descended 3 hours after the fleet achieved stable orbit, its hull bearing the sigils of the Departamento Munitorum, the administratum branch responsible for collecting military tithes across the Imperium. I stood waiting on the palace landing platform with my full senior staff, all of us dressed in our formal regalia, surrounded by ceremonial guards whose presence was required by protocol when receiving Imperial officials. The air was cold that morning, wind carrying dust from the mining operations that never ceased their grinding extraction of ore from our world's bones. The shuttle's boarding ramp extended with a hydraulic hiss that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning silence. 3 figures emerged from the interior, administratum officials whose uniforms marked them as mid-level bureaucrats authorized to conduct tithe collection operations according to established procedures. They moved with the mechanical precision of people who had performed this ritual countless times across dozens of worlds, their faces showing no emotion, no acknowledgement of the significance this moment held for those waiting to receive them. The lead official, a man whose age I could not determine beneath the augmetics that replaced portions of his skull and face, stepped forward and produced a data slate from his robes. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat monotone of someone reading from prepared text, executing a script that allowed no deviation for individual circumstances or contextual considerations. "Governor Lethric Mordain," he said without waiting for my acknowledgement or greeting. "I am Adept Tertius Callion of the Departamento Munitorum, authorized to conduct tithe collection operations on behalf of the Adeptus Administratum. Our records indicate that Salvarus Secundus is scheduled to deliver the following obligations during this collection period: 1,200,000 tons of processed ore for allocation to Forge World production facilities, 3,000 trained PDF soldiers for conscription into Astra Militarum service, 47 sanctioned psychers for transport to Terra via Black Ship, various manufactured goods and processed materials, as detailed in Assessment Documentation File, reference 7739 Alpha. You will have 30 standard days to complete delivery of all required tithes. Failure to meet these obligations will result in consequences as outlined in Imperial Law, Section 12, Subsection 44, Paragraph 9. The words struck me like physical blows, each requirement recited with bureaucratic precision, hammering home the reality I'd been dreading for 18 months. No mention of our petition, no acknowledgement of the disaster that had destroyed our primary mining capacity, no adjustment to the assessed obligations that I knew we could not meet. Just the cold recitation of requirements based on production figures calculated 5 years ago when our world still possessed the infrastructure necessary to deliver what the Imperium demanded. "Adept Callion," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the panic rising in my chest, forcing myself to maintain the professional demeanor expected from planetary governors conducting official business with Imperial representatives. I submitted a formal petition 18 months ago requesting tithe adjustment following a catastrophic seismic event that destroyed mining complexes 4, 5, and 6, resulting in loss of 60% of our ore production capacity and casualties exceeding 200,000 workers. The petition included comprehensive documentation of the disaster, geological surveys, casualty figures, production capacity analysis, and justification for reduced assessment based on established precedent and Imperial law. I formally request confirmation that this petition was received and processed according to proper administrative procedures. Adept Callion's expression did not change at my words, his augmetic eyes showing no reaction, his posture remaining rigidly formal. He turned his attention to his data slate, fingers moving across its surface with practiced efficiency, accessing records and reviewing documentation with the enhanced cognitive processing speed that his augmentations enabled. The silence stretched while he searched, while I waited, while my entire senior staff stood frozen waiting for confirmation that our petition had been acknowledged. That the administratum understood our circumstances, that some accommodation would be made for the disaster that had crippled our world's ability to meet its obligations. The search took nearly 2 minutes, an eternity of waiting while Adept Callion reviewed whatever records existed in the administratum's vast database regarding Salvaris Secundus and its tithe status. When he finally looked up from his data slate, his expression remained unchanged, his voice still carrying that same emotionless monotone that stripped all human context from the words he spoke. No record exists of the petition you describe, Governor Mordain. Our assessment documentation for Salvaris Secundus shows no pending modification requests, no filed appeals, no annotations indicating special circumstances requiring review. The current tithe obligations remain unchanged from the assessment conducted 5 standard years ago, according to regular evaluation schedule. You will deliver the full amount as specified in current assessment documentation. Failure to comply will be addressed through appropriate channels as outlined in Imperial law. The bureaucracy had swallowed our petition. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the administratum, in some department processing millions of similar requests annually, our carefully documented appeal had been lost, misfiled, buried in processing queues that might take decades to clear, or simply never entered into official records despite the astropathic confirmation we had received. The earthquake was irrelevant. The casualties were irrelevant. The destroyed infrastructure was irrelevant. All that mattered to the administratum was what existed in their official records, and those records showed no knowledge of circumstances that might justify adjusting our assessed obligations. I attempted to explain, to present evidence, to demonstrate that our world had suffered a disaster that made compliance impossible regardless of our efforts or dedication. I showed them geological surveys documenting the seismic event and its effects. I presented casualty reports listing the names of 200,000 dead workers. I provided production capacity analysis, proving we could not extract ore from facilities that no longer existed. I cited Imperial law and precedent and established procedures for handling natural disasters affecting tithe compliance. Adept Callion reviewed every document I provided with the same mechanical efficiency, his augmetic eyes scanning data, his enhanced cognitive systems processing information faster than unmodified human brains could manage. Then he set aside my evidence and repeated the same statement he had delivered upon arrival. The assessed tithe stands. You have 30 standard days to complete delivery of all required obligations. The next 5 days were consumed by increasingly desperate attempts to make Adept Callion understand our situation, to convince him that we were not refusing payment out of rebellion or negligence, that we simply lacked the physical capacity to produce what the Imperium demanded. I appealed to logic, to mercy, to the Emperor's wisdom that surely recognized the difference between willful failure and unavoidable tragedy. I invited the administratum representatives to visit our destroyed mining complexes, to see the collapsed galleries and understand the scale of destruction we faced. I offered every piece of evidence, every argument, every appeal that might convince them to either delay collection until our petition could be properly reviewed or adjust our obligations to reflect our current production capacity. Adept Callion listened to every appeal with the same patient expression, the same professional courtesy extended to desperate planetary governors across the Imperium who faced circumstances they believed justified special consideration. When I exhausted my arguments, he responded with words that revealed the fundamental nature of the system we served. "Governor Mordain," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something beyond complete emotional neutrality, perhaps sympathy, perhaps simple recognition of human suffering, even if such recognition could not influence his duties. The Imperial tithe system operates according to established protocols designed to maintain consistency across tens of thousands of worlds spanning the entire Imperium. Individual circumstances, however tragic or compelling they may appear to those experiencing them, cannot be allowed to disrupt the machinery that keeps humanity's interstellar empire functioning despite countless threats to its survival. Your petition, regardless of its merit or the validity of circumstances it described, has not been officially processed through proper administrative channels. Whether this failure resulted from transmission errors, processing delays, or simple bureaucratic mistakes is irrelevant to your current obligations. The Administratum operates according to what exists in official records, and those records show no approved modification to your assessed tithe. Until such modification is officially authorized and entered into our database, your obligations remain unchanged. I understand that you believe you cannot meet these obligations. I understand that your world has suffered a disaster affecting your production capacity. I understand that you consider the current assessment unjust given circumstances beyond your control. But understanding does not modify requirements. The tithe must be paid according to official assessment. Failure to deliver will be treated as non-compliance requiring intervention according to established protocols. You have 30 standard days. I understood then the true nature of our situation with the clarity that comes from having every illusion stripped away, every hope exhausted, every appeal rejected. The Administratum was not cruel or malicious or intentionally ignoring our suffering. It was simply too large, too complex, too burdened by its own mass to accommodate individual disasters with anything approaching timely response. My petition had entered a system where millions of similar requests competed for attention from overworked adepts, where whole departments could become lost in recursive loops of bureaucratic procedure, where essential communications regularly failed simply because the volume of information overwhelmed any attempt at efficient processing. The Imperium functioned despite these failures, accepting them as inevitable costs of governing on an interstellar scale where perfect communication and coordination were impossible regardless of technology or procedures. But individual worlds paid the price for systemic limitations, their fates determined not by the merits of their circumstances, but by whether the machinery happened to process their requests before crises became catastrophic. I had 30 days to deliver ore that my world could not produce. The next 25 days descended into organized madness as I implemented every extreme measure available to bridge the gap between what we could produce and what the Imperium demanded. I ordered our remaining mining complexes to operate at absolute maximum capacity, suspending all safety protocols, abandoning maintenance schedules, pushing equipment and workers beyond any reasonable limits in desperate attempts to extract every possible gram of ore from our depleted facilities. Workers labored through shifts extended to 30 or even 40 hours, their bodies sustained by chemical stimulants provided by our medical staff, their exhaustion overridden by drugs that kept them functioning despite physiological limits, screaming for rest. The casualties began immediately. Exhausted workers made fatal mistakes, missing warning signs of unstable galleries, failing to properly secure equipment, falling asleep at critical moments when alertness meant the difference between survival and death beneath collapsing rock. Overstressed machinery broke down with increasing frequency, suffering catastrophic failures that killed operators and destroyed facilities that we desperately needed to maintain production. Each death, each accident, each equipment failure reduced our capacity even as we demanded more output, the mathematics of industrial operations proving inexorable regardless of desperation or determination. I stripped our strategic reserves completely, confiscating every gram of processed ore that existed anywhere on our world, regardless of its intended purpose or long-term importance. Food stocks that had been maintained against future famines were surrendered to meet quotas. Building materials reserved for infrastructure maintenance were seized and added to our tithe delivery. Personal possessions containing processed metals were confiscated from citizens who protested but could not resist when PDF soldiers arrived, with requisition orders backed by my authority as planetary governor. I bankrupted our world purchasing ore from neighboring systems, spending every credit in our discretionary budget, liquidating centuries of accumulated wealth, mortgaging future tax revenue to buy what we could not produce. Transport costs consumed resources almost as quickly as we could arrange deliveries, the economics of interstellar shipping making such purchases ruinously expensive. But I authorized every transaction that might add to our accumulating stockpile. Our children would inherit a world crushed by debt, but they would at least inherit a world rather than graves in radioactive ash if we failed to meet our tithe and face the consequences of that failure. I even authorized the dismantling of selected infrastructure, the careful disassembly of buildings and equipment to recover processed metals that could be added to our tithe delivery. Administrative facilities were torn down, their support frames cut apart and transported to collection points. Decorative elements from the governor's palace were stripped away, centuries of artistic achievement reduced to raw materials measured by weight rather than cultural value. Nothing was sacred, nothing protected, everything sacrificed in desperate attempts to accumulate the tonnage that might save us from Imperial judgment. 26 days after the Tithe fleet arrived, I reviewed our final accounting with Tertius Galen, both of us examining numbers that represented the absolute limit of what our world could deliver, despite destroying ourselves in the attempt. 893,000 tons. We had exceeded my initial projections through measures so extreme they would cripple Salvarus Secundus for generations. But we remained 107,000 tons short of the Imperial assessment. I reported these figures to Adept Callion on day 27, presenting the documentation with all the careful attention to proper procedure that I had maintained throughout this nightmare, despite knowing the outcome was predetermined by mathematics that could not be negotiated or adjusted. He reviewed the numbers with his characteristic mechanical efficiency, his augmetic eyes scanning our production reports, his enhanced cognitive systems processing data faster than I could follow. Then he set aside the documentation and delivered the assessment I had been expecting. Insufficient. The tithe remains unfulfilled according to official assessment requirements. Non-compliance has been confirmed and recorded in official documentation. The Adeptus Arbits has been notified of your failure to deliver assessed obligations. They will arrive within the next standard week to address this matter according to established legal protocols. The Adeptus Arbits. The Emperor's law enforcement authority, answerable only to the High Lords of Terra themselves, empowered to supersede even planetary governors in matters affecting Imperial law and order. Their jurisdiction included enforcement of tithe compliance, investigation of planetary governance, determination of whether failure constituted simple incompetence, criminal negligence, or active rebellion against Imperial authority. Their arrival meant my authority was suspended, my position forfeit, my family's 3-generation legacy ended because a petition was lost, and a planet could not deliver ore that did not exist. I had 3 days before the Arbites arrived to conclude official business and prepare for whatever investigation and judgment they would conduct. I spent those days ensuring my staff understood their responsibilities would continue under new governance, that workers and citizens would receive whatever protections I could arrange through final executive orders, that my family would have access to the resources they needed to survive the coming transition. Helena understood what was happening without needing explicit explanation, her intelligence and decades of partnership allowing her to read my emotional state and recognize that the crisis had passed beyond any hope of resolution. We did not discuss my likely fate. There was no point in giving voice to realities we both understood. Instead, we spent those final days together as much as official duties allowed, finding comfort in familiar routines and small intimacies that had sustained our marriage through decades of challenges less catastrophic than this final crisis. She did not ask me to flee or resist or attempt some desperate measure that might delay but could not prevent the consequences already set in motion. She simply remained beside me, providing the support and partnership that had characterized our relationship since we had taken our marriage vows in the palace chapel, surrounded by family and friends who believed our future stretched before us, unchanged for generations to come. The Adeptus Arbits arrived on schedule, their fortress precinct ship settling into orbit like divine judgment made physical, its black hole bristling with weapon systems that could reduce our world to ash if rebellion or resistance complicated their mission. Their shuttles descended without fanfare or announcement, landing at designated coordinates around our primary population centers, disgorging arbitrators whose authority superseded mine from the moment they set foot on Salvarus Secundus. They came for me at dawn, 6 arbitrators in full combat armor, their presence outside my chambers announced by servitors whose protocols required notification, even though resistance was neither expected nor possible. I dressed in my formal gubernatorial robes, gathering a few personal items, leaving final messages for Helena and my children explaining that I loved them and regretted the legacy I was leaving them. Then I walked out to face the arbitrators waiting to escort me into custody. No violence occurred during my detention, no excessive force, no theatrical displays of authority. The arbitrators simply took me into custody with professional efficiency, their movements precise and practiced, their methods proven across thousands of similar operations on hundreds of worlds. They transported me to their shuttle under guard, processed me through their security protocols, assigned me a holding cell in their fortress precinct, where I would remain during their investigation of circumstances surrounding our Tithe failure. The cell was small but adequate, containing a cot, basic sanitation facilities, and nothing else beyond what was necessary for human survival. They fed me according to regular schedules, provided adequate hygiene supplies, ensured I suffered no physical hardship during my detention. The Arbits were not cruel. They simply did not care about my comfort or distress beyond maintaining my health for whatever legal proceedings would follow their investigation. I was evidence to be preserved, a subject to be processed, a problem to be resolved according to protocols refined over 10,000 years of enforcing Imperial law across millions of worlds. 10 days passed in that cell before I was finally summoned to face judgment. 10 days of solitude broken only by the arrival of servitors, delivering food and removing waste. 10 days without news of what was happening outside, whether my family had been arrested or remained free, whether my staff faced charges or continued performing their duties under new authority. 10 days alone with my thoughts, reviewing every decision I had made, every action I had taken, searching for the moment when I might have changed course and avoided the fate that now seemed inevitable. The tribunal was held in a chamber aboard the fortress precinct, a room designed for exactly this purpose, with no decoration beyond the aquila displayed prominently on one wall. 3 arbitrators sat in judgment, their positions representing the full authority of Imperial law. I stood before them without restraints, permitted to speak in my own defense, allowed to present evidence and explain circumstances according to legal procedures that had been established and refined over millennia of maintaining order across humanity's scattered worlds. I spoke for nearly an hour, detailing the earthquake that had destroyed our mining capacity, the petition I had submitted through proper channels, the extreme measures I had implemented attempting to meet our obligations despite impossible circumstances. I presented every document, every survey, every report that might demonstrate my good faith efforts and explain why our world had failed to deliver the assessed tithe. The arbitrators listened with expressions that revealed nothing, their augmented minds processing my testimony, their enhanced judgment systems comparing my words against codified legal standards and documented precedent. When I finished, they conferred briefly in whispers I could not hear, reviewing data slates and legal references, consulting precedent and regulations that governed cases like mine. The senior arbitrator delivered their judgment with the same emotionless precision that Adept Callion had used, when announcing our tithe obligations, his voice carrying no anger or satisfaction, simply the weight of law applied without consideration for justification or circumstance. Governor Lethric Mordain, you are found guilty of failure to deliver the imperial tithe as assessed by the Departamento Munitorum and recorded in official documentation. The specific charges are as follows: failure to meet imperial tithe requirements in the amount of 307,000 tons of processed ore, dereliction of duty as planetary governor in maintaining production capacity sufficient to meet assessed obligations, incompetence in governance resulting in circumstances that endangered the Imperium's ability to prosecute necessary military operations and maintain essential functions. Your explanation regarding the seismic disaster affecting your world's mining infrastructure is noted and acknowledged as factually accurate. Your petition requesting tithe adjustment is noted and acknowledged as properly submitted according to established procedures. However, neither of these circumstances constitutes legal justification for failure to comply with officially assessed imperial obligations. The absence of approved tithe adjustment in official records does not excuse non-compliance with requirements that remain legally binding until formally modified through proper administrative channels. Under imperial law, as codified in Section 12, subsection 44, paragraph 9, failure to deliver assessed tithes carries mandatory penalties designed to maintain consistency of enforcement across all imperial worlds, regardless of individual circumstances. These penalties cannot be waived or modified based on explanations or justifications that, while potentially valid, do not appear in official records at the time of assessment. Therefore, you are sentenced to execution by firing squad, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. Your family will be stripped of all titles, assets, and authority. Your position as planetary governor is forfeit effective immediately, with replacement to be determined through administratum appointment procedures. Your personal property and family holdings will be seized by imperial authorities to partially offset the shortfall in tithe delivery. This judgment is final and not subject to appeal. The words washed over me with the inevitability of death itself, each sentence hammering home the reality that I had known was coming, but had somehow hoped might be avoided through some last-minute intervention or reconsideration. But there would be no mercy, no accommodation, no recognition that I had been a faithful servant destroyed by circumstances beyond my control, and a bureaucratic failure that had lost my petition in processing channels that might not clear for decades. I was not being executed for rebellion or corruption or malice. I was being killed because the system required consistency, demanded consequences, needed examples that demonstrated failure, carried costs regardless of justification or explanation. My death would serve a purpose in the larger machinery of imperial governance, warning other planetary governors that tithe obligations must be met, that disasters did not excuse non-compliance, that the emperor's due could not be negotiated or delayed regardless of circumstances. They returned me to my cell where I spent my final night writing this account, documenting the events that led to my execution in hopes that future governors might learn from my fate. I wrote not seeking sympathy or vindication, but simply recording reality for anyone who might read these words and need to understand the true nature of the system they served. The Imperium is not evil. The Administratum is not intentionally cruel. The Arbites are not motivated by malice or sadism. They are simply components of a machine too vast to accommodate individual suffering, too complex to respond with anything approaching human empathy, too burdened by its own impossible scale to distinguish between unavoidable tragedy and willful rebellion. The system functions according to its fundamental design, grinding on regardless of what it costs, regardless of who it consumes, regardless of whether justice is served or innocent lives destroyed. Dawn arrived with the inexorable certainty of all endings, The arbitrators came for me at the designated hour, their movements efficient and professional, their weapons prepared and checked, according to protocols that left no room for error or malfunction. They escorted me to the execution ground, a courtyard within the fortress precinct designed specifically for this purpose. Walls that had witnessed countless similar deaths across the centuries since the fortress precinct had first arrived in our system. I stood against the designated wall without restraints because I offered no resistance, wearing the simple prison garments that had replaced my governor's regalia, facing the 10 arbitrators who formed the firing squad according to regulations governing proper execution procedures. The senior arbitrator read the formal charges and sentenced one final time, his voice carrying clearly in the dawn silence, ensuring that official protocol was followed precisely even at this final moment. The weapons fired with synchronized precision, last bolts punching through my chest with burning impacts that destroyed vital organs, ending life within seconds. I felt no prolonged pain, only spreading cold and the strange detachment that accompanied the knowledge that consciousness was ending, that the self I had been for 53 years was dissipating like smoke in wind. My final thought was not fear or regret, but simple wonder at how quickly everything ends, how fragile human existence proves when measured against the vast machinery of imperial necessity that continues grinding regardless of who falls beneath its wheels.